start off in the world, 1066 and all that, the Norman conquest and so on. You've got, typically of European countries, you've got some kind of feudal system in place. Here's a crude representation of it. Notice on the right-hand side you've got granting land. Land is the source of wealth, the main basis of wealth. The king, by conquest or by inheritance, as it were, is in charge. All the land in the country is notionally held off the king. We still maintain that fiction today. So the king grants land to barons, who grant land to knights, who grant land to villains, and you've got the feudal pyramid hierarchy. And the villains in return have to provide food and have to provide soldiers and money, so the king has got the taxes and the army he needs to retain control and go conquer other things. Okay? So, it's key characteristics of in this worldview. You've got, it's essentially top down. Power flows from the top. If you're down here, and believe it or not, there are people like underneath this who don't even get on the charts, hundreds perhaps, you don't have any power. So that's the most one of the key characteristics. The next thing is that moving upwards is very, very difficult. People are born into their place, and they haven't got much choice but to know their place and get on with it. There is a parallel hierarchy in the church, and you will see in the church a little bit more upward mobility than you'll see in civil society, as it were. Getting educated and so on can get you promoted in the church. It didn't happen too often in this way. There's a bit of it. So that's another characteristic, minimal upward social mobility. It's male dominated. Okay? The whole thing is run on men governing men, serving men, and so on. Then you've got the problem of unpersons. And you could almost say that in terms of power and influence, women would verge on being unpersons in this sort of system. But you've also got the fact that below here there are people who probably they didn't get on the chart. It's estimated by one writer, Ian Morton has just published a little book called Centuries of Change. He estimates that 1 in 10 of the human beings in England just after the Norman conquest was a slave. We don't talk about slavery at that stage in the UK, but apparently that's his argument. So you've got this notion that there are people who don't count at all in our consideration. What dignity might they have? Now I want to go to the other end of the scale, as it were. Possessive individualism. I could just call it individualism, but Sidney McPherson's phrase, possessive individualism. And the reason I choose possessive is I think there is a really important notion of ownership and possession underlying the way we think about rights and our dignity. It is our dignity, they are our rights, it is our bodies, our freedom of movement, our freedom of speech. And we like to control the things that are ours. In that feudal hierarchy, you might have some land granted to you, but it's like not yours. You can't quite control it. You haven't got freedom to decide what to do with it or not do with it. So I'm just trying to bring that out. And the individualism is the key, but the possessive notion is also quite important. So we look out for the ideas of ownership and property in the way we use our language about it.
When you ask people, they don't say, oh, well, the worst aspect about being poor is that I don't have enough money. They say that, but it's that's fairly low down on the scale. So their income is important, but it's not the main thing. And almost always the case, they say the worst thing about my situation, my poverty situation, is that I can't write or I can't read. So adults will say, well, I'm illiterate, so I can't participate. Right? I don't have the ability to be involved in society because I don't. And the worst thing about being poor is that I'm not an educated person, and that really defines their situation. And they you ask them, they're kind of apologetic, as if it's their fault, And so it's the kind of literacy, lack of access to education. So one thing that they stressed, there was one UNDP assessment I was involved in Southeast Asia, quite a large one. And of course, everybody thought, because it's a low-income country, everybody would highlight this or help, but they didn't. They said the worst aspect is, I can't participate in decision making. I can't even read, the notes which are provided on the packet for my fertilizer and that kind of thing. So they felt powerless because they had a lack of education. And that's the one thing that people who are living in poor houses always say is the worst aspect of their situation. Right? People don't respect them because they're not educated. Right? So that's and then this kind of the second thing kind of follows on from this. They say I feel like I'm voiceless. I don't have the educational experience. I don't have the knowledge. I can't participate in decision making, and all these decisions are made elsewhere for me, and I can't be involved in it, and so I don't have any voice. I'm powerless. So this immediately alerts you to the fact that the worst aspects about not being accorded respect because you're poor is because you lack education. Because of that, you don't have a voice, and because of that, you can't participate, and because of that, you feel powerless, and therefore you feel dependent on somebody else, and then you're in that position. Right? So those are the kind of things, and this is kind of the justice thing is sort of hard. And of course, you work in countries where there's been ongoing conflict, so of course people want justice for what's happened to them. But they actually highlight the justice in relation to the education and the lack of voice. So the powerlessness and the lack of access to justice are the most important things that are highlighted. And after that, of course, you have health, and particularly health for women and children's health. That's highlighted. But it's surprising that the way in which we conventionally think about poverty is not necessarily the aspects which are highlighted by the people who are poor themselves. So dignity for me, if you like, means finding ways for people households to get themselves out of poverty, developing strategies for that, so they're accorded greater respect, and alleviating poverty. But the most important aspects of poverty are these: lack of illiteracy, lack of participation, and once there can be improvements in those areas, then development can be enabled. But it's those things which are highlighted. So for me, in my field anyway, there's the relationship between you not being accorded respect relates to your poverty, but developing strategies for getting out of poverty focuses very much on areas that conventionally from outside we may not think are the most important, but are the most important factors for those people who lack dignity and who are because they're poor. So that's essentially from a perspective from my own.
And the term critical disability study is very important, because what we don't do, we don't say to teachers, oh, there's a child with special needs, you've got to do this, because actually it's a lot more nuanced than that in terms of dignity. And one of the first things we do is talk to our students about the fact that they're located in a very privileged part of the world in terms of the human rights of disabled children who have access to school and everything else. But to be very clear that the majority of disabled people globally live in the majority world, i.e. things like poverty, conflict, preventable disease and so on. These are the things that cause the majority of impairments across the whole of the world. So 600 million people are disabled globally. 82% of those people live below the poverty line. 80% of disabled people are located in majority world countries. And this thing about conflict and poverty and preventable disease and everything else, it's really chimes with what you were saying earlier. And this thing about international development needs to embrace the requirements of disabled people as well. So I'm going to look at the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and this was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2006, and many countries globally have signed up to the convention and the optional protocol. It took us 3 years to sign up to it, which I think is pretty tragic, but you know, what can you say? So this is the definition. Disability is an evolving concept, results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinder full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So, and then talking about various impairments which are relevant to that definition, but very clear in human rights terms that we look at what it is that a person who has an impairment themselves experiences in terms of interactions with other people, interactions with society, and this is very relevant to the concept of dignity. So Article 1 of the UN Convention.
Just to wind up now, thinking particularly about legal conceptions of dignity. When I was talking earlier, I was really giving you something that looked a bit like this. The idea of dignity might have a feudal status kind of dimension to it, that the libertarian notion emphasises autonomy, and then we're talking about welfare. So those are, in a way, sort of three big categories. None of those sound immediately legal. But if you look at it in finer shades, and you've heard virtually every one of these finer shades in at least once in the talks you've just heard, dignity as status. Our status was more or less entrenched in law in the feudal times. So and the notion of honours has got a kind of a legal flavour to it. The dignity of offices, somebody is a mayor, somebody is a prime minister, somebody is a judge, somebody is a bishop, and so on. Those kind of things. The law has got something to do with that. The law may not be getting it right. You may say that the law is getting it wrong in some places, but nevertheless it's implicated, it's involved. Dignity of status that we might gather through socio-economic success is not a legal concept, but the law of contract, company law, taxation, whatever underlies the engines of economic development and of exploitation. This one, the dignity of bearing. Perhaps you've heard about that really in 2 or 3 of the talks this morning, but that doesn't. The law doesn't really capture that terribly well at all. Dignity of appearance, aesthetic dignity, again, I don't think the law has much to say about beauty, right? Dignity is the right to and ability to decide for yourself, the dignity of autonomy. Yeah, that has got an awful lot to do with the law. The notion of autonomy is actually self-law, your right to decide for yourself. And then welfare. Many of the welfare interventions, housing law and so on, we've just been looking at, are essentially they are legally have a legal framework. And so we can stick those other concepts around there like that. I want to just say 2 or 3 more things, and then we have a comfort break. The argument, in a way, is that the law itself has a kind of dignity. Why do we obey the law? Is it because we agree with it, or because we're frightened of it, or is it because we, in a sense, believe in the institution of law, even though we don't believe in that, in the wisdom of that particular law? You know, a particular bus lane, for example, you might decide that it would save the planet if you went down the bus lane, because after all, you wouldn't be sitting in a queue emitting noxious fumes. Try telling that to the judge. But on the other hand, you might say, well, I ought, saving the planet, but I must obey the law. We talked about due process and fair hearings. Up to a point, the law does guarantee fair hearings. As Anne was saying, it doesn't work properly. But nevertheless, we can't imagine getting these disputes resolved and these hearings done properly without, as it were, some law to tweak, some law to improve. So law has a lot to do with due process. Part of its dignity is in due process, and part of its function is to protect the dignity of those who are involved in those processes.
Yeah, those more modern individuals. But I'm a biological anthropologist, so I have a dual sort of interest. I'm interested in biology. That was my original training. That's my degree, was as a biologist. And then I got interested in human evolution, really big time, and then took that on as my postgraduate work. And one of the things that I've always been interested in, one of many, many things that I've been interested in, is the evolution of human cognition. How we got to have the sort of thoughts and behaviour that we have, that we think of as being human. So what I found was that the more that I looked into this, the more I worked on it, the more I researched into it, the more I read other people's work, the more muddy the waters become, the more difficult it is to decide what actually is being human. So I'm going to sort of show you what I'm going to talk about today. So this is the outline of my talk, and I always do this so that people know where we're going with the talk. I want to talk about evolutionary and biological basis of the things that we would need to have to consider the concepts, to build up those concepts that are part of what we think of as human dignity. I'm also going to give you some examples from the fossil and archaeological record. And then I'm going to go on and talk about cultural perspectives. And I'm going to do that because part of the day job that I've had at the museum has been to head up the Human Remains Unit. Now, one of the things there is to look after the collection, to allow visits to that collection, and to do bring what we call a data collection project, but it was bringing everything up to modern standards that we would think of both in care and in the documentation. But we had another job, and that job was the repatriation of human remains. We can talk a bit about that a bit later in the context of human dignity. But that introduced me to the idea of how culture actually also influences how we determine what is dignity. Now, Max had, I work on a Mac, and so you can guarantee when you do it, when it comes onto a PowerPoint, it's never quite how you expected. So I think we're going to have a little bit of this. Lots of words that we have when we think about what it is to have human dignity. Lots of concepts. Those words are all there. But do they mean the same to all of us? How we interpret those words, how we use them, how we put them into action when we're talking about what it is to have human dignity, do we mean exactly the same things? And I would say that we probably agree in general terms, which is why when we come to write things about humans, and I've written all sorts of guidance documents, and being involved in guidance documents to do with human remains. And one of the things we always put in is we would treat the remains of these ancient people with dignity and respect, but we never say what that actually means. We never say how we're going to do it, what that means. We use this wonderful term and everyone buys into it from all sorts of cultures, and then we have problems because we don't all agree about when we actually go down to actually touching those remains, what it is that gives or takes away dignity. So this is why when Andy asked me to do this, I was quite interested to do it because it was quite a nice thing to sort of explore. So the basis of the ideas and the concepts behind human dignity are actually there within human behaviour. And human behaviour is just another aspect of ourselves that is also influenced by evolution, and it is an adaptation to our environment. It's a way of dealing with the world around us. And even things like morality, which you might not think could possibly just evolve, they don't just pop up. They are there already grounded, they're part of behaviour. And so the idea and the ability of producing something like morality is also potentially comes from the idea of our evolution and from our cognitive evolution.
Political choice to protect certain groups in certain ways. But should the great apes be free from death, detention and torture in the same way that people should, for very similar reasons? That's that's the argument. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'd like to open it up to everybody else rather than...
Yeah, good.
There are a couple of questions that I would like to ask. I'm not on either side at the moment, but I'd like to sort of ask or think about what those rights would be. I might be stupid, but I just need to know what their rights would be. And is there something about us projecting ourselves onto apes? So because we recognise some qualities that they have as being human, are we then saying, well, then that means that they must be higher and deserving of rights? So I'm just interested in that idea. What would they do with their rights? Yeah, something like, and these sorts of questions, aren't all animals feeling creatures with their own language? Is it really just important that we recognise the language of apes, therefore they must be somehow higher, deserving of rights? And when we talk about apes having rights, are we really talking about the need or the desire for human beings to change certain behaviours? Is that what we're really talking about, projecting? So we're saying, right, no more zoos, because we're talking about apes having rights. So there seems to be lots of questions other than just yes or no.
I've got a subsidiary question which has sparked in my mind, is if you don't know you've got rights, because it would be pretty difficult to communicate the fact that an ape has rights to an ape, do you have rights? Is it possible to have rights but not to know about them? If, as you say, it comes out of the way we choose and live our lives.
Yeah.
If you look at the concepts of assistance animals, there's an interesting comparison with apes and dogs. In the States, for example, a lot of people that are wheelchair bound, perhaps devoid of the power of speech, had small apes as assistants, animals for want of a better word. Difference is, with a guide dog, for example, that guide dog is trained by the Guide Dogs and Blind Association, and it's a fairly balanced relationship between the human and the guide dog. With some of the assistance apes, they actually have a battery pack on there that the disabled person can hit if the ape goes to attack him. So there's a disparity between the way we look at assistance dogs and the way we look at assistance apes.
Okay. At the back, yes.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Maybe everyone knows the answer except me. I don't know. I have the same question. What the rights are actually? If we are giving them the rights, is it to freedom in their own inhabitant, in their own natural inhabitant? So we are destroying them, or taking them to the human world in a zoo. You know, in this way we are imprisoning them, then we are violating their rights. If at least one or two couple of a group we are not bringing to the human society, then we human have to go in apes culture to bring the information from them, and it will be very dangerous for the human being to go there. So it will be the who will protect that human rights. So it's little bit, I'm a little bit confused about those rights and how will be given those rights and how will be protected those rights, and when those rights will be given to the apes, is it parallel to the human, or will it bring any danger to the human rights?
Yeah.
This bit of the conversation kind of coming on it. There's a case going on in New York at the moment about Tommy the chimpanzee, and there's a New York-based organisation that is bringing a claim in the American courts for the rights of Tommy the chimpanzee. And you can find him on the internet. In fact, I think somewhere on page 7 of the handout for my thing, one of those links is to Tommy, if I remember rightly. And you can see him in his cage, and it's not much of a cage. So what actually they're arguing for is not for Tommy to be able to vote. They're arguing for Tommy to be moved to a bigger cage and a better cage. And I think what this bit of the discussion uncovers, it is interesting. There is a very profound connection between rights and dignity, but they're not the same thing.
What context is he held?
And it's perfectly possible for there to be some obligations that begin from duty. If you start with autonomy, and you say we've got rights because we're autonomous, that's because we can choose and all that sort of thing. So we're in a vegetative state, have our rights disappeared? We're only a little baby, have our rights disappeared? We're a chimpanzee, have our rights disappeared? Chimpanzees can choose to do things, can't they? They choose to do this and not that. Do they get rights because they can choose? Or is there something there which is based on our interests? You said that the great apes can suffer. I mean, it's Peter Singer's great question. Can they suffer? If they can suffer, then actually, it's talked about the rights, but actually we're saying we have a duty to look after people who can suffer.
But all animals, can't all animals suffer?
And it's only as a consequence you could call their position rights, but actually the fundamental bit is not a right at all. It's a duty which is born of recognising some dignity, some respect that we own.
But don't
So
all animals,
is that
sorry, don't all animals have rights? I mean, all animals can feel,
Well,
can't
it's
they?
always called animal rights movement,
So,
isn't it?
so it's all linked. So it's giving rights to apes and all animals.
Well,
That would make
there is no right answer to this debate. What's interesting about this debate is we learn a lot about ourselves, we learn a lot about rights and stuff as we go along. There is a body of opinion that animals all should have rights. The issue of rights in relation to the great apes was quite deliberately picked out and concentrated on. Because for some people, they deserved rights and other animals didn't, or at least not for the same reasons. But also, if you're ever going to win that argument, you would win it in relation to the great apes. You might win it in relation to whales and dolphins, but we don't know as much about them. It's easier to have that discussion than it is in relation to a chicken. I think one of the issues that's at play here is there is suffering in the sense of the ability to feel pain. And there is a much more tricky concept of mental anguish, knowing that you're going to die tomorrow, for example, bereavement, and these kind of natures. So let's just come back to you so that you can
Is that
finish up.
the sense of humans
our sense of duties, given them their right. So the Homo sapiens, the human being, actually defining what the other species' right will be, right? So this is we are defining actually what because if the chimpanzees can think, we can give him the pictures, 3 pictures: a small case, a big case, a small forest, a big forest, with a lot of chimpanzees. So he's gonna choose. I'm gonna go there, but we are not giving them that choice. We advocated for a big case because this is for our benefit. We want them to go to a free place because we want them to keep in our society because it is benefited for us. So we are not giving chimpanzees option. We are taking the better option, which we decide.